World leaders are heading into the United Nations as we speak. Here is a live look inside. In less than an hour, President Obama will address the General Assembly.
He'll also be meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin and is expected to confront him over rising tensions in Syria and in Ukraine. Margaret Brennan has the details ahead of the meeting.
For the first time in more than a year, President Obama will meet with Vladimir Putin. The Russian president's recent military buildup in western Syria, seen in these satellite images, blindsided U.S. officials who fear more bloodshed. The president's isolation of Putin after the Russian seizure of Crimea failed to stop him. And with the U.S. reluctant to act in Syria, Putin has stepped into the void, taking advantage of the chaos to prop up his longtime ally, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. Putin also claims that he'll begin to fight ISIS.
The risk of having Russia involved in Syria is that suddenly it becomes not just a regional problem or a Syrian civil war, but a great power conflagration.
The White House was also caught off guard Sunday when the Iraqi government announced that it would share intelligence on the Islamic State with the Russians, plus Syria and Iran.
We have concerns about how we're going to go forward.
In a meeting with his Russian counterpart, Secretary of State John Kerry said the U.S. needs to know what Putin is planning. French warplanes carried out their first airstrikes in Syria on Sunday. U.S. intelligence officials estimate that the number of foreign fighters joining ISIS in Iraq and Syria has doubled in the past 12 months to 28,000 volunteers from over 100 countries. And a $500 million U.S. program to train and equip Syrian rebels has largely failed. Less than 100 are on the battlefield, and some recently gave their weapons to the al-Qaeda-linked Nusra Front in exchange for protection.
State Department correspondent Margaret Brennan joins us now from the United Nations. Margaret, what can we expect to come out of this meeting?
Well, it's not clear. What is expected is that the Russian president will use the podium here on the world stage at the UN today and in the closed-door meeting with President Obama to lay out his vision for Syria, not only what that means in terms of the war against ISIS, which is what Putin claims he's focused on, but also just what exactly he's trying to do here when it comes to Bashar al-Assad, his longtime ally, who the U.S. believes has to go in order to ultimately defeat ISIS, because the U.S. and its allies say that it is Assad who has drawn in all these foreign fighters to join the ranks of extremist groups. So without getting him out of power, you can't solve the other terrorism problem. But honestly, by the end of the day, it's unclear if we'll see any new element to the U.S. strategy, which remains militarily fighting ISIS while trying to negotiate Assad to step down from power.
You know, it wouldn't be too difficult for these two leaders to pick up the phone and call each other. Why is a face-to-face meeting so necessary between them?
Well, two things. One of them is that this is actually a sign that Vladimir Putin has turned the U.S. strategy of isolating him on its head. If you remember, the White House made a very big deal of its decision nearly 2 years ago to say we're not going to talk directly with Russia, and they canceled President Obama's meetings back in 2013 with Putin because they said if you misbehave, you don't get this kind of FaceTime with the leader of the free world. Unfortunately, that didn't stop Putin from his military action in ultimately seizing Crimea from Ukraine, and now this military buildup in Syria. The White House is saying, okay, well, given where we are, given the level of crisis, the refugees that are flooding into Europe as a result of the war, the conflict with ISIS not ending anytime soon, maybe we do need to sit down with a man who has now forced himself into the middle of this conversation by building up such a significant military presence in Syria.
You mentioned in your piece that the Iraqi government announced that it will be sharing intelligence with Russia. Should the U.S. be concerned?
Well, this really blindsided the White House, and for that reason it should be concerned, particularly considering Vice President Biden just spoke with the Iraqi Prime Minister in the past 48 hours or so. So for the U.S. to not be aware of What Baghdad was going to announce is significant, particularly considering that the U.S. is running bombing missions in Iraq to help buttress that government in its fight with ISIS, and the fact that the U.S. is militarily and financially supporting that government. So this doesn't look good, and it certainly doesn't feel good for those who are saying that there is a united coalition to fight ISIS. It also is a sign here that Russia has inserted themselves in a significant way. Vladimir Putin trying to say, hey, I'm a global leader, I'm a global player. You need to talk to me if you ultimately want to win this war. But the U.S. truly has some deep reservations about whether bringing Russia into the coalition against ISIS, A, could ever happen, and B, whether they could ever legitimately defeat ISIS if Russia's intentions aren't as clear as stated.
Right. So both leaders will be presenting speeches. What are they expected to address in their speeches today?
Vladimir Putin's expected to lay out his vision for the Middle East and for Syria. President Obama would much rather talk about some of his diplomatic successes. He wanted to use this stage as a victory lap, not just on Iran and that nuclear deal, but he's going to point to that as a sign of what could be possible if you can get an international coalition together. He's going to say, this isn't just up to America to solve the world's problems. We need partners. That means you all need to cough up your share of support, whether it's dealing with the refugee crisis in Europe or one of his personal goals, which is trying to get a climate change agreement, basically a broader agreement to protect the environment. He wants a significant one in place by December. So that's what the president would like to be talking about. He will lay out those things, but really this crisis in Syria and the refugee crisis that's resulted is overshadowing everything right now.
Yeah, Margaret Brennan at the United Nations headquarters. Thanks a lot, Margaret.